true. All I want to say is that they don't really care about us.
Dear friends, Black Lives Matter is a social and political movement. What began as a Twitter hashtag in the year 2013 in the United States has today become a global phenomenon. Its mission, according to its official website, blacklivesmatter.com, is to eradicate white supremacy. Aim is to build local power strong enough to prevent racially motivated violence against black people. However, unlike other movements like civil rights movement in the 1960s or a Pakistan movement for that matter, where at the center of the struggle was Muslim League with formally elected leadership, Black Lives Matter is decentralized in character, which means that it has no central structure or formally elected leadership. It's open for all, for everyone anywhere in the world who believes that black lives in particular matter and are willing to devote their time and energy for that cause. And this is the reason why most names associated with this movement are not its leaders. We know that civil rights movement was spearheaded by Martin Luther King Jr. At the heart of Pakistan movement was Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah. But no such name can be associated with Black Lives Matter. Instead, it is known by its victims. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, hence victims have led the foundation of Black Lives Matter. It began in 2013 in the United States after a white American, George Zimmerman, who shot and killed a black American, was declared not guilty of murder. Instead, he was set free of all charges after claiming self-defense. This was followed a year later by the death of Michael Brown, an 18-year-old African American who was killed by a police officer on suspicion of stealing a pack of cigars. This incident increased the popularity of Black Lives Matter. It now took to the streets to demand for justice for Michael Brown. However, what brought this movement to everybody's attention was the killing of George Floyd on 25th of May 2020. George died after Derek Chauvin, a police officer, knelt on his neck for nearly 9 minutes, despite being repeatedly told, "I cannot breathe." An estimated 15 million to 26 million people participated in protests in the United States, with massive protests in the UK, Europe, Canada, and other countries around the world, making Black Lives Matter one of the largest movements in the history of the United States. More recently, protests have once again erupted after a jury decided not to charge police officers for the death of Breonna Taylor, a black woman who was shot 6 times and killed. She bled to death and officers did not even bother to provide her medical help. Question is, what it means to be black in the world's most powerful country claiming to be the leader of the free world. In fact, these incidents, though may seem unprecedentedly brutal to us, are not new for African Americans. They have been crying we cannot breathe for centuries. So what it means to be black in America? Or as the brother of George Floyd asked the US Congress,
is that what a black man is worth? $20?
Answer lies in what historian Carol Anderson called the longest ongoing saga of racial discrimination in American history. The answer lies in the history of African Americans. History tells us that African Americans, which today form the largest racial minority group in the United States, were originally slaves. They were first brought to American colonies by European settlers in 1619. Reason? They provided for a cheap labor, easily available to be driven like a cattle. Hence, all along they were kept in miserable conditions. They were not allowed to speak their languages or practice their religions. They were not even allowed to identify themselves with their family names. Instead, names such as niggers, negroes, blacks, and colored were used to call them.
Days ago, I was with my family, in my home. Now you tell me all is lost. Tell no one who I am. That's the way to survive.
So after the American Revolution, when the American colonies gained independence from the British Empire to form the United States of America, the southern part of the country, the South, was an agricultural economy. And therefore they needed these slaves to work in their fields. The North, on the other hand, was made up of cities and factories. They didn't need slaves. Instead, they hired people who worked in their factories. Besides, there was an abolitionist feeling in the North which made them against the institution of slavery. So this difference has to be made. South, an agricultural economy. North, not an agricultural economy. South, needing slaves to work in their farmlands. They needed them for the production of crops. North didn't need slaves. Instead, they hired people to work in their factories. South in favor of retaining the institution of slavery. North not in favor of retaining the institution of slavery. They wanted to abolish it. So this difference, along with other differences between the North and the South, led to what is known in history as American Civil War in 1861. What triggered the war was after 11 states in the South broke away from the United States to form their own confederation. Consequently, the South lost the war. And it was during the war that President Abraham Lincoln issued an Emancipation Proclamation on 1st January 1863, which made it official that enslaved people from now onwards shall be forever free. However, this proclamation did not apply to all states, but only to states in rebellion. It was 2 years later that the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution was passed, which officially abolished the institution of slavery in the United States. This was followed by the 14th Amendment, which granted equal protection to all citizens. And finally, the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed that a citizen's right to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous state of servitude. Hence, black or white all became equal before the law.
No more driving slash for me. No more, no more, no more pounding salt for me. No more, no more, no more ocean block for me. No more, no more.
As a result of these amendments to the Constitution, things began to improve for African Americans. So much so that they started winning elections to southern state governments and even to the US Congress. But their growing influence could not be tolerated by the whites in the South. Remember, they had lost the war, but they were still in favor of retaining the institution of slavery. So what they did, since they could not amend the Constitution as it would require the support of the North, once they regained control, they enacted laws, or so-called Black Codes. Aim was to deprive African Americans of the rights they had won with the passing of 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and to make sure that they were once again available for labor. They introduced poll taxes and made literacy exams compulsory to prevent African Americans from voting. They were denied education, housing, and employment. They were arrested for minor crimes and were even given long-term prison sentences. And as if it was not enough, this was followed by segregation laws or Jim Crow laws. These laws separated blacks from whites everywhere. Hotels, restaurants, barbershops, theaters, every other establishment. There were even separate schools for black and white students. Thus we see that constitutionally Americans were bound by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to regard African Americans as humans and equal citizens, but by enacting laws such as Black Codes and Jim Crow laws, they ensured to deny them services that must be afforded to human beings. And it was not until the civil rights movement of the 1960s which finally ended these laws. and African Americans began to reclaim their rights. Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Interracial marriages became legal in 1967. So things were once again changing for the better for African Americans. But again, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the champion of civil rights movement in 1968, created a rift between Black and white Americans, leading to several days of riots, looting and burning. The African Americans once again began to feel that the tide was turning against the civil rights movement. But their moment came when Barack Obama was elected the President of the United States in 2008. But ironically, even with Black president at the helm of affairs, things did not change for African Americans. And his 2 terms in office could not end racism in America. And under Trump presidency, who passively supported white supremacists as good people, tensions have reached whole new heights. So now that we know the history of African Americans, we may ask, where is the fault line? We saw reforms undertaken to improve the lives of African Americans, such as the 13th, 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So what is it that's still being left unfulfilled? Answer lies in America's neglect of the past, its failure to learn from its mistakes. Remember American Civil War 1861, when 11 southern states seceded from the United States and launched the Civil War to defend slavery and lost it. The United States did not punish soldiers and politicians who participated in the war. In any country, this would amount to an act of treason, punishable by death. But the United States did nothing. Instead, their influence grew so much that it contributed to erasing the rights that African Americans won through amendments to the Constitution. In fact, many Americans still today celebrate those soldiers and politicians as their heroes. Similarly, American terrorist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan were made up of soldiers who participated in American Civil War. These groups have terrorized blacks for centuries. The United States has not criminalized these groups and has instead celebrated them as their heroes. This is where the fault lies. After the Second World War, Europe did not allow fascists and Nazis to regain their lost ground. In fact, many European countries have laws against Holocaust denial, including in Germany, where the denial of Holocaust in public is a crime punishable by up to 5 years in prison. This law was passed in 1960 because anti-Semitism was re-emerging in European societies. So what they did? They nipped the evil in the bud. No more talk on the subject. Does the United States have any such laws to punish white supremacists if they question African Americans' equality before the law? This is where the fault lies. A 2004 study by the American Psychological Association has found that blacks are often associated with adjectives such as dangerous, violent, criminals, and aggressive. Also in 2019, data compiled by the National Academy of Sciences has proved that more African Americans are likely to be killed. They are arrested at a high rate and imprisoned 5 times the rate of white Americans. So it is in this context that Black Lives Matter as a movement is to be understood. This brutality against blacks is deep-rooted in American history. And what is needed is a complete restructuring of American society to make it more equitable. So until the United States address this racist ideology through education, making reparations and giving exemplary punishments, these unjust killings of black people will continue with impunity for speaking up, resisting, or merely existing.